An 18-year-old left the only home he'd ever known, and what he discovered at an abandoned farm would change everything. Subscribe, like, and tell us where you're watching from. Would you dare step inside that barn? The morning I turned 18, I woke up in the same narrow bed I'd slept in for the past 12 years, staring at the same water-stained ceiling of Riverside Children's Home. The building smelled like it always did, a mixture of industrial cleaning solution, overcooked oatmeal, and the particular mustiness that comes from too many people living in too little space for too long. My belongings fit into a single duffel bag, which sat packed and ready at the foot of my bed. I'd been preparing for this day for months, counting down with a mixture of anticipation and terror that I tried not to show on my face. Freedom, I told myself repeatedly, was just a matter of crossing the threshold with my bag and never looking back. But freedom, I was beginning to understand, came with a price tag I hadn't quite calculated. My name is Lucas Bennett, and Riverside had been my home since I was 6 years old, since the night my mother dropped me off with a promise to return that she never kept. The staff were kind enough, in the distant, professional way of people paid to care, but not required to love. I'd made friends, lost friends to adoption or aging out, and learned early on that the world divided itself into those who had people and those who had to become their own people. I fell firmly into the second category. Mrs. Patterson, the home's director, met me in her office after breakfast. She was a woman in her late 50s, with grey hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of mild surprise. She handed me an envelope containing my birth certificate, social security card, and a check for $375, the sum total of the modest savings account the state had maintained on my behalf. "There's also this," she said, sliding a second older envelope across the desk. The paper was yellowed at the edges, and my name was written across the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. "This arrived for you about 10 years ago. The instructions were to give it to you when you left our care." My hands trembled slightly as I picked it up. The envelope was sealed, and something about its weight suggested more than just a letter inside. "Who sent it?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "We don't have a record of the sender," Mrs. Patterson replied, but something in her tone suggested she knew more than she was saying. "The instructions came through a lawyer who's since retired. I tried to track down more information a few years ago, but the trail went cold." I turned the envelope over in my hands, feeling the rectangular outline of something solid inside, along with what seemed to be folded papers. A key, perhaps, or something similar. My heart hammered against my ribs with a force that felt almost painful. "You should also know," Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice taking on a more cautious tone, "that we're required to inform you about available resources, transitional housing programs, job placement services, continuing education support. You don't have to figure everything out alone, Lucas." I nodded, though we both knew I'd already made my decision. I'd been working part-time at a grocery store for the past year, saving every dollar I could. I had enough for a cheap motel room for a few weeks while I figured out my next steps. Or at least that had been my plan until approximately 30 seconds ago, when this mysterious envelope had appeared and rewritten every assumption I'd made about my future. I thanked Mrs. Patterson, shook her hand with what I hoped was appropriate gratitude, and walked out of Riverside Children's Home for the last time. The April morning was cool and bright, the kind of weather that felt full of promise even when you had no particular reason to feel hopeful. I made it approximately 3 blocks before I couldn't wait any longer. Sitting on a bench at a bus stop, I tore open the envelope with hands that had forgotten how to be steady. Inside, I found a brass key, old and heavy, with an ornate head that suggested it belonged to something significant. Folded around it was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting shaky but legible. The message was brief. "Lucas, if you're reading this, then you've grown into the young man I always hoped you'd become. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I need you to trust me. Your mother didn't abandon you. She had no choice. The key in your hands belongs to a property that's been in our family for 3 generations, A farm outside of Miller's Creek, about 40 miles from where you are now. The address is written on the back of this letter. I couldn't raise you myself for reasons I can't explain in writing, but this place is yours. It always has been. Go there. Inside the main barn, beneath the third floorboard from the eastern wall, you'll find answers to questions you've been asking your whole life. I'm sorry for the years we lost. I'm sorry for everything. With more love than you know. Your grandmother, Eleanor. I read the letter 3 times, each pass filling me with a different emotion. Confusion, anger, desperate hope, and beneath it all, a gnawing suspicion that this might be some cruel joke. But the key in my hand was real, solid and cold against my palm, and the address on the back of the letter was specific. 1847, Blackstone Road, Miller's Creek. I pulled out my phone and searched for the address. The property appeared on the map, an isolated dot surrounded by empty green space that suggested farmland or wilderness. Street view showed nothing, the camera having apparently never ventured down that particular road. I checked the bus routes and found one that would get me within a few miles of Miller's Creek. From there, I'd have to walk or hitch a ride. The logical part of my brain, the part that had kept me safe and sane through 12 years of institutional living, screamed that this was reckless, that I should use my $375 for rent and groceries, not for chasing a probably fictional grandmother's cryptic message to a farm that likely didn't even exist anymore. But the other part of my brain, the part that had spent countless nights imagining why my mother had left me, what family I might have had, what history had been stolen from me, that part was already standing up from the bench and heading toward the bus station. I bought a ticket with money I couldn't afford to spend and climbed aboard a bus that smelled like stale coffee and diesel fuel. As the city slowly gave way to suburbs and the suburbs melted into farmland, I kept running my thumb over the grooves in the key, feeling its weight as a kind of promise. Whatever waited at 1847 Blackstone Road, it was mine. It had always been mine. And for the first time in 12 years, I felt like I might be heading towards something that resembled a home. The bus dropped me at the edge of Miller's Creek just before noon, in front of a gas station that looked like it had been built sometime in the previous century and never updated. The attendant inside, a man with the impressive beard and suspicious eyes, gave me directions to Blackstone Road with the kind of reluctance that suggested he didn't get many visitors asking about that particular location. "That's the old Brennan place," he said, his tone suggesting that this information should mean something to me. "Hasn't been anyone out there in years. You sure that's where you're headed?" I nodded, thanking him and declining his offer to call someone to give me a ride. I wanted to approach whatever waited for me on my own terms, without witnesses or explanations. The walk took longer than I'd anticipated. Blackstone Road turned out to be more of a suggestion than an actual road, a dirt path that wound through increasingly dense woods before opening suddenly into cleared farmland. The transition was jarring, like stepping through a curtain from one world into another. And there it was. The farm sat in a shallow valley, surrounded by overgrown fields that had once been cultivated but had long since surrendered to wild grass and scattered saplings. The main house was a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged dangerously on one side. Several outbuildings dotted the property, including what looked like a chicken coop, a storage shed, and dominating the landscape, a massive red barn that had faded to a rusty orange under years of sun and neglect. Everything about the place spoke of abandonment, of time passing without human intervention, of stories that had ended without proper conclusions. I stood at the edge of the property for a long moment, my duffel bag heavy on my shoulder, trying to reconcile the reality before me with the hope I'd built during the bus ride. This was supposed to be mine. This collection of rotting wood and broken windows, this monument to decay. I felt something hard and bitter rising in my throat, disappointment mixed with anger at myself for believing, even for a few hours, that the letter might have offered something real. But I'd come this far. I owed it to myself, if not to the grandmother I'd never known, to at least check the barn, to look beneath that third floorboard from the eastern wall and see if there were really answers waiting or just more emptiness. I approached the barn carefully, testing each step as the ground beneath me alternated between packed dirt and patches of mud that suggested recent rain. The barn doors hung slightly open, one tilted at an angle that indicated broken hinges. I pulled them wider, the wood groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the sunlight filtering through gaps in the walls and the open door behind me. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light, and the smell of old hay and dry rot filled my nostrils. The barn was largely empty, a few pieces of ancient farming equipment rusting in corners, some rotted bales of hay stacked against one wall. Birds had nested in the rafters, and their droppings covered much of the floor in white streaks. I pulled out my phone and used its flashlight to examine the eastern wall, counting floorboards from where the wall met the ground. The third board was wider than the others, and when I knelt beside it, I could see that it had been disturbed more recently than its neighbors. The nails that should have held it down were missing, and when I worked my fingers under the edge and pulled, it came up easily, revealing a dark space beneath. My heart was hammering now, that same desperate hope from earlier returning despite my best efforts to suppress it. I shone my phone's light into the gap and saw a metal box, about the size of a shoebox, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust. I lifted it out carefully, surprised by its weight. The box wasn't locked, just latched, and when I opened it I found myself staring at contents that made absolutely no sense. Inside were bundles of cash, neatly wrapped in rubber bands, more money than I'd ever seen in person. Beneath the cash were photographs, dozens of them, showing a woman I recognized from the single picture I had of my mother. Except, in these photos, she looked older, and she was always with the same man, someone I'd never seen before. They looked happy in most of the pictures, laughing, embracing, living a life that seemed completely disconnected from the story I'd been told about my past. But it was what lay beneath the photographs that made my hands start shaking. Documents. Official-looking papers with government seals, court orders, custody agreements that had been overruled, restraining orders, police reports. And at the bottom, a thick envelope marked with my name in my mother's handwriting. I pulled it out with trembling fingers and tore it open. The letter inside was long, written on both sides of multiple pages, and as I began to read by the light of my phone, the barn around me seemed to disappear. "My dearest Lucas," it began. "If you're reading this, then Elena kept her promise and gave you the key when you turned 18. I'm writing this when you're only 5 years old, sleeping in the next room, and I'm praying you never have to read these words. But if you do, then the worst has happened, and you need to know the truth." The letter went on to explain a story I could barely comprehend. My father, the man in the photographs, had not been the person my mother thought he was when they met. He'd presented himself as a successful businessman, charming and generous, and by the time she discovered the truth, they were married, and she was pregnant with me. The truth was that he was involved in something illegal, something dangerous that she didn't fully understand until it was too late. Money laundering, she thought, possibly worse. When she tried to leave, he'd made it clear that she would never be allowed to take me. He had connections, lawyers, people in positions of power who owed him favors. The custody battle had been brutal and rigged from the start. "I had 2 choices," my mother wrote. "I could stay and raise you in that environment, watching him shape you into something I couldn't bear to imagine, or I could disappear and hope that without me, he'd lose interest. Eleanor, your grandmother, helped me create a third option. We made it look like I'd abandoned you, left you at Riverside where he wouldn't think to look, somewhere you'd be safe even if you'd never understand why. Edna was supposed to watch over you from a distance, to make sure you were all right, and to give you this when you were old enough to understand, and old enough to be beyond his reach." My eyes burned as I read, the words blurring slightly. The letter continued, explaining that my father had died 3 years after I was placed at Riverside, a heart attack at 41 that my mother learned about through a lawyer. By then, she was living under a different name in a different state, and she'd been told by everyone who'd helped her that returning for me would raise questions that could endanger us both. "I know this doesn't make the years apart hurt any less," she wrote near the end. "I know this doesn't give you back your childhood or fill the hole I left in your life. But I need you to know that every single day I thought about you. Every single day I wondered what you looked like, what you sounded like, what kind of person you were becoming. The money in this box is everything I could save, everything I put aside hoping that one day you'd find it and it might give you a start in the life you deserved. I don't know if I'm alive as you read this. Eleanor was already sick when we made this plan, and I don't know if she survived long enough to give you the key. But whether we ever meet again or not, know that you were loved. You were always loved. You were never abandoned. You were protected the only way I knew how." The letter was signed with her name, Rachel, and beneath it, an address in Oregon and a phone number. My hands were shaking so badly now that I could barely hold the pages. I sat there on the dirty floor of the barn, surrounded by decay and bird droppings and the smell of rot. And for the first time since I was 6 years old, I let myself cry. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place I'd kept locked away for 12 years. Hey, if you've made it this far in Lucas's story, I want to take a moment to ask you something. His whole life, he believed he'd been abandoned, that he wasn't wanted. But the truth was so much more complicated than that. Sometimes the stories we tell ourselves about our past aren't the whole picture, and sometimes the people we thought didn't care actually loved us more than we could imagine. If this story is hitting you the way I think it is, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button because we share real stories about real struggles here, and this community is built on people who understand that life isn't always simple. And drop a comment telling me, have you ever discovered something about your past that completely changed how you saw your life? I read every single comment, and I love hearing your stories. Now let's get back to Lucas, because what he found next made him realize that his mother's letter wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. I don't know how long I sat there on that barn floor, but eventually the tears stopped, and I was left with a strange, hollow feeling, like something had been carved out of my chest, and I wasn't sure yet what would fill the space. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and forced myself to look at the contents of the box again, this time with clearer eyes. The money was substantial. I counted it twice to be sure. $23,000 in various denominations. It was more than I'd ever imagined having, enough to change everything about the precarious future I'd been planning. But it was the other documents that held my attention now, the ones I'd barely glanced at before reading my mother's letter. There were property deeds, legal papers showing that this farm, all 47 acres of it, had been transferred to a trust in my name when I was 7 years old. Eleanor Brennan, my grandmother, had been the trustee until her death, which according to a death certificate in the pile had occurred just 14 months ago. She'd been 72. And the cause of death was listed as pancreatic cancer. She'd held on long enough to arrange everything, to make sure the key would reach me, but not long enough to see me receive it herself. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I'd had a grandmother, someone who'd cared enough to protect this inheritance for me, to maintain the legal structures that would ensure I received it. And I'd never known she existed, never had the chance to thank her, to know her, to hear stories about my mother as a child, or my family's history. Another loss, to add to the collection I'd been accumulating since I was 6 years old. I gathered all the documents and photographs carefully, returning them to the metal box, along with the cash. My hands moved automatically, my mind still processing everything I'd learned. The barn suddenly felt too small, too confining, and I needed air, needed space to think. I picked up the box and my duffel bag and walked out into the afternoon sunlight. The farm looked different now, not just an abandoned property, but my abandoned property, a legacy I hadn't known existed, a connection to people who'd made impossible choices trying to protect me. I walked toward the main house, testing the porch steps carefully before putting my full weight on them. The front door was locked, but one of the windows had a broken pane, and I was able to reach through and unlatch it from the inside. The interior of the house was dusty and clearly hadn't been occupied in years, but it was in better condition than I'd expected. The furniture was still there, covered in sheets that had turned grey with time and dust. The kitchen had old appliances that probably hadn't worked in a decade, and the wallpaper was peeling in long strips that revealed older layers beneath. But the bones of the place were solid. The floors didn't creak dangerously, and when I tried a faucet experimentally, rusty water eventually sputtered out, suggesting the well still functioned. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, where 3 bedrooms opened off a central hallway. The largest one had a bed frame and a dresser, and on the dresser, protected under a layer of dust, sat a framed photograph. I picked it up carefully and used my sleeve to wipe the glass clean. The photo showed a young woman, maybe in her early 30s, standing in front of this very house. The paint wasn't peeling then, and flowers bloomed in beds along the porch. The woman was smiling, one hand raised to shade her eyes from the sun, and even through the fading colors of the old photograph, I could see the resemblance. She had my eyes, my chin, the same slightly crooked smile I saw in the mirror. Eleanor, I thought, my grandmother in happier times, before whatever happened to fracture this family into pieces. I set the photograph down gently and continued exploring. In the smallest bedroom, I found more evidence of Eleanor's presence: a shelf of books, mostly gardening guides and old novels, a sewing basket with thread and needles still organized neatly inside, and in the closet, clothes from decades past, hanging like ghosts of a life I'd never witnessed. But it was what I found in the second bedroom that changed everything again. This room was different from the others. While the rest of the house showed signs of gradual abandonment, this space looked like someone had left in a hurry and never come back. The bed was unmade, clothes were scattered on a chair, and on a small desk under the window sat a laptop computer. It was old, probably 8 or 9 years out of date, but when I opened it on a whim, the battery was dead, but the power cord was still plugged into the wall. My heart racing with a mixture of hope and dread, I pressed the power button. Nothing happened for a long moment, and I was about to give up when the screen suddenly flickered to life, showing a login screen with a single user account, Eleanor Brennan. No password required. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the mousepad. This felt like a violation, looking through a dead woman's computer, invading the privacy of someone who'd tried to help me, but never gotten the chance to explain herself. But I'd come too far to stop now, learned too much to pretend I could walk away without knowing everything. I clicked on the account and waited while the desktop loaded. What appeared made my breath catch in my throat. The desktop background was a photo of a little boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, playing in the front yard of this house. The boy was laughing, caught mid-motion as he chased what looked like a butterfly or moth. The boy was me. I recognized the shirt I was wearing, remembered it vaguely from the handful of memories I had from before Riverside, which meant that Eleanor had known me, had spent time with me before everything fell apart. I wasn't just an abstract grandchild she'd been protecting from a distance. I had been here, in this house, part of her life, until the day I wasn't. The realization made the years of separation feel even more cruel, even more wasteful. I opened the documents folder and found it meticulously organized into subfolders. One was labeled Legal and contained scanned copies of all the documents I'd found in the barn box, plus dozens more. Custody filings, appeals, private investigator reports about my father's activities, correspondence with lawyers. Eleanor had been actively involved in the effort to keep me safe, had spent what looked like a small fortune on legal fees, trying to find a way to bring me back without alerting my father to where I'd been hidden. Another folder was labeled Lucas Riverside. Inside were reports, official and unofficial, documenting my time at the children's home. School records that someone had obtained, probably through less than legal means. Photographs, taken from a distance, showing me at various ages. Playing in the Riverside yard at 7, waiting at a bus stop at 11, walking home from my grocery store job at 17. She'd been watching over me the entire time, documenting my life like a researcher studying a subject she couldn't approach directly. The thought should have felt invasive, creepy even, but instead I felt a strange warmth spreading through my chest. She'd cared. She'd never stopped caring. But it was the third folder that made me finally understand why Eleanor had never been able to bring me back, why my mother had stayed away, why this entire elaborate structure of secrets and separation had been necessary. The folder was labeled simply Evidence, and inside were files that detailed something far darker than I'd imagined. My father hadn't just been involved in money laundering. He'd been part of an organized crime network that had connections reaching into law enforcement, local government, even child protective services. The private investigator Eleanor had hired, a former FBI agent named Webb, had documented a pattern of children being used as leverage against people who tried to leave the organization. Custody battles that were mysteriously decided in favor of the parent still cooperating with the network. Children who disappeared into a system that claimed to be protecting them, but was actually ensuring their parents' continued compliance. According to Webb's reports, my father had explicitly threatened that if my mother tried to take me and run, he would use his connections to ensure she was charged with kidnapping, parental interference, possibly worse. The courts would side with him, he'd told her, and she'd spend years in prison while I grew up under his control. The only way to keep me truly safe, Webb had concluded in a report dated 3 months before I was placed at Riverside, was to make it appear that my mother had abandoned me in a way that wouldn't trigger my father's interest or alarm. If I was left at a state facility with no clear connection to either parent's family, I'd become just another lost kid in the system. Tragic, but not worth the trouble of tracking down. And it had worked. The final documents in the folder showed that my father's associates had made some cursory inquiries about my whereabouts in the first year, but had eventually concluded that my mother had probably left me with friends or distant relatives somewhere untraceable. Without her around to use me as leverage, and with plenty of other priorities demanding their attention, they'd moved on. I sat back in the chair, my mind reeling. Everything I'd believed about my abandonment, every bitter thought I'd had about my mother's selfishness, every moment I'd spent wondering what was wrong with me that had made her leave, all of it had been based on a lie. Not a malicious lie, but a necessary one. A lie that had kept me alive and free. The sun was setting now, orange light slanting through the dusty window, and I realized I'd been in this house for hours, lost in the digital archaeology of my own past. I closed the laptop carefully and stood, my legs stiff from sitting so long. I had decisions to make, important ones that would shape whatever came next. But first, I needed to process what I'd learned, needed to sit with the weight of it. I walked back downstairs and out onto the porch, where I could watch the sun sink below the tree line at the edge of the property. The farm was quiet except for the evening songs of birds and the rustle of wind through the overgrown grass. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost sacred, as if the land itself was holding space for grief and revelation. And that's when I heard it. The sound of a vehicle approaching on the long dirt driveway, engine rumbling, moving fast. Too fast for a casual visitor. My body tensed instinctively, that old survival instinct from years of institutional living kicking in. I moved to the edge of the porch, staying in the shadows, and watched as a dark pickup truck came into view, trailing a cloud of dust behind it. The truck came to an abrupt stop about 30 feet from the house, and for a long moment, nothing happened. The engine idled roughly, and I could see the silhouette of someone behind the wheel. But the setting sun created a glare on the windshield that made it impossible to identify who it was. My mind raced through possibilities. None of them good. Had someone been watching the property? Had my arrival somehow triggered an alert? Was this connected to my father's old associates? Some delayed alarm finally going off after all these years? I thought about the metal box inside, still sitting on the kitchen counter where I'd left it, filled with cash and evidence that suddenly felt incredibly dangerous. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, maybe in his early 60s, with grey hair and a weathered face that suggested a life spent outdoors. He wore jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints didn't work quite as smoothly as they used to. He stood by his truck for a moment, surveying the property, before his eyes found me in the shadows of the porch. "You must be Lucas," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. There was no threat in his tone, just a kind of weary certainty. I didn't answer immediately, trying to assess the situation. How did he know my name? How did he know I'd be here? The man seemed to sense my hesitation and held up both hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "My name is Marcus Webb. I worked for your grandmother." The name hit me like an electric shock. Marcus Webb. The former FBI agent, the private investigator whose reports I'd been reading just minutes ago, the man who documented the danger that had necessitated my separation from my family. "You're dead," I said, the words coming out before I could think better of them. The last report I found was from 9 years ago, and it said the investigation was closed because... I trailed off, not wanting to finish the sentence. Webb's expression darkened slightly. "Because I'd supposedly died in a car accident," he finished for me. "Yeah, that's what the official record says. Had to make it look convincing, or the people I was investigating would have kept looking for me. Eleanor helped arrange it, actually. Gave me enough money to disappear properly, start over, somewhere they'd never think to look." He took a few steps closer, moving slowly, clearly trying not to spook me. "I've been keeping an eye on this place ever since she died. She made me promise that if you ever showed up, I'd make sure you understood everything, make sure you knew what you were walking into." "And what exactly am I walking into?" I asked, my voice harder than I intended. Webb sighed and glanced around the property as if checking for observers. "Can we talk inside? What I need to tell you isn't something I want to shout across an open field." Every instinct I had screamed caution. This could be a trap, an elaborate deception to get me to lower my guard, but something about Webb's demeanor, the genuine fatigue in his eyes, the way he held himself like a man carrying the weight of old promises, made me believe him. Besides, if he'd wanted to hurt me, he could have done it already. I was alone, isolated, and nobody knew where I was. I nodded slowly and gestured toward the door. "It's open." We went inside, and I led him to the kitchen, where there was enough light from the last rays of sun coming through the window. Webb looked around the space with an expression that might have been nostalgia. "I spent a lot of time in this house," he said quietly. "Eleanor was a good woman, dealt with more pain than anyone should have to carry." I leaned against the counter, keeping distance between us, my hand near the metal box, though I wasn't sure what I'd do with it if things went wrong. "So talk. Tell me what I'm walking into." Webb pulled out one of the kitchen chairs and sat down heavily, like a man who'd been standing too long. "Your father's organization," he began, "the one your mother ran from, it didn't disappear when he died. These things don't work that way. The network adapted, reorganized, and kept operating. Most of the people involved moved on to other things, but a few, the ones who were in deepest, they stayed active." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "When Eleanor hired me, I went deep into their operations. Too deep, probably. I learned things they didn't want known, documented connections they'd worked hard to hide. That's why I had to fake my death. They were getting close to figuring out who was digging into their business." "But why does that matter now?" I asked. "My father's dead. I've been in the system for 12 years. Nobody's looking for me." "That's true," Webb acknowledged. "And it should stay that way. But there's something you need to understand about this property, about why Eleanor set things up the way she did." He gestured around the kitchen, then toward the barn visible through the window. "This farm isn't just your inheritance, it's also your grandmother's insurance policy. Before she died, she transferred everything I'd gathered, all the evidence I'd compiled about the organization, and stored it here. She knew that if anything ever happened to you, if your father's old associates ever came sniffing around, that evidence could be used to destroy them completely. It was her way of making sure you stayed protected even after she was gone." The implications of what he was saying sank in slowly. "You're telling me this place is basically a target? That I've inherited a property that's sitting on evidence that could put dangerous people in prison?" "Not exactly," Webb said. "Nobody knows the evidence is here. Eleanor was very careful about that. As far as anyone in that organization knows, I disappeared with everything I'd collected, and it probably got destroyed when I supposedly died. They have no reason to think about this farm or about you." "Then why are you here?" I demanded. "Why risk exposing yourself by coming to talk to me?" Webb's expression became even more serious. "Because Eleanor set up a dead man's switch. If you ever tried to sell this property, if you ever brought in surveyors or contractors or anyone who might stumble across where she hid the evidence, it would trigger a message to go out to certain people. Federal prosecutors she trusted, journalists who'd been investigating organized crime. The evidence would be released, and a whole lot of powerful people would find themselves in very serious trouble." He leaned forward, his eyes locked on mine. "What I'm telling you is that you need to be very, very careful about what you do with this place. You can live here, you can restore it, you can make it your home, but you can't sell it, can't develop it, and you absolutely cannot start digging around the property without knowing where Eleanor buried the evidence. Because if the wrong people find out what's here, they won't just come for the documents. They'll come for you, to make sure you can never point anyone in the right direction." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. What I'd thought was a gift, a chance to start over with resources and a connection to my past, was actually a responsibility I'd never asked for and a danger I didn't know how to navigate. "Where?" I managed to ask. "Where did she hide it?" Webb shook his head. "She never told me. Said it was safer if I didn't know. That way if anyone ever tried to make me talk, I couldn't give them what they wanted. But she left instructions somewhere on this property, telling you exactly where to find it and what to do with it if you ever needed to use it." "The laptop," I said suddenly, remembering. "She had a laptop upstairs. There might be something on it." Webb's eyebrows rose. "That would make sense. She was meticulous about documentation. If she left instructions, they'd be thorough." We went upstairs together, and I showed him the computer I'd found. Webb examined it carefully, then navigated through the files with the confidence of someone familiar with Eleanor's organizational system. After several minutes of searching, he found a folder I'd missed, hidden in a nested directory and labeled simply with a date, my 18th birthday. Inside was a single video file. Webb looked at me, his expression unreadable. "This is for you, not me. I'll wait downstairs." After he left, I sat down in front of the laptop and double-clicked the file. The video player opened, and after a moment of black screen, my grandmother's face appeared. She looked older than in the photograph downstairs, her hair completely grey, and her face thin in the way of someone fighting a serious illness. But her eyes were bright and focused, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. "Hello, Lucas," she began. And despite everything, despite never having heard her voice before, something in it felt familiar, like an echo of something I'd forgotten. "If you're watching this, then you found everything I left for you, and Marcus has probably scared you half to death, explaining about the evidence." She smiled slightly, a sad expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm sorry for putting this burden on you. It wasn't fair, but then again, nothing about your situation has been fair from the beginning." She shifted in her chair, and I could see she was sitting in the very room where I now sat, the same window behind her showing the same view of the property. "The evidence is buried in the barn, under the floor where you found the metal box. There's a false bottom in that space, and beneath it is a waterproof container with copies of everything Marcus collected. Bank records, recorded conversations, photographs, documentation of illegal activities going back 15 years. Enough to put at least a dozen people in prison for a very long time. Eleanor paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. You have three choices, Lucas. First, you can leave everything where it is, live your life here or elsewhere, and treat the evidence like a nuclear deterrent, something that exists only to prevent anyone from threatening you. Second, you can retrieve it and turn it over to the authorities Marcus and I identified as trustworthy, letting justice take its course even though it might put you at some risk. Or third, you can destroy it completely, eliminate the danger and the responsibility both, and just try to move forward with your life. Her expression softened, and for the first time, I saw what might have been tears in her eyes. Whatever you choose, know that I loved you. I loved you from the moment you were born, and every day since has been colored by the pain of not being able to be your grandmother properly. Your mother loved you too, more than anything, and the choices we made, the lies we told, the distance we maintained, all of it was because we believed it was the only way to keep you safe. Ulu. The video continued for a few more minutes, with Eleanor sharing small stories about my mother as a child, about my great-grandparents who'd built this farm, about the history I'd been disconnected from. And then she signed off with a simple message. Be brave, Lucas, be careful, and know that whatever you decide, you're not alone. You never were. The screen went black, and I sat in the darkness of the room, listening to the old house settle around me, thinking about choices and consequences and the strange inheritance of other people's wars. I sat in that room for a long time after the video ended, staring at the blank screen as darkness settled completely over the farm. Downstairs, I could hear Webb moving quietly around the kitchen, giving me space to process what I'd learned. The weight of my grandmother's message pressed down on me, each option she'd presented carrying its own gravity. Leave the evidence buried and live with the knowledge that dangerous people might someday come looking. Turn it over to the authorities and risk exposure, retaliation, becoming a target for whatever remained of my father's organization, or destroy it entirely and eliminate both the danger and any chance of justice for whatever crimes those documents detailed. None of the choices felt right. None of them felt safe. But then again, I thought bitterly, safety had never really been part of my story. Eventually, I went back downstairs. Webb was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of water he'd apparently felt comfortable enough to pour from the rusty tap. He looked up when I entered, his expression carefully neutral. I need to see it, I said. The evidence. I need to know what we're actually talking about before I can decide anything. Webb nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this. That's fair. Your grandmother would have approved of that, not making blind choices. We took flashlights from Webb's truck and walked out to the barn through the gathering darkness. The structure loomed against the night sky, its familiar shape somehow more ominous now that I understood what it was hiding. Inside, using the flashlights to navigate, we made our way to the spot where I'd found the metal box. Webb knelt beside the hole I'd left open and examined it carefully. There, he said, pointing to what looked like a solid bottom to the space beneath the floorboard. See how that board sits slightly differently? That's the false bottom your grandmother mentioned. He worked his fingers around the edges until he found a grip, then lifted. The board came away to reveal another space beneath, deeper than the first, and nestled in it was a large waterproof case, the kind used by hikers and kayakers to protect valuable items from the elements. We carried it back to the house and set it on the kitchen table. The case was sealed with heavy-duty latches, and when Webb opened them with a click that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet house, I found myself holding my breath. Inside, protected by layers of plastic sheeting, were documents, hundreds of pages, meticulously organized in labeled folders. Bank statements showing money moving through shell corporations. Transcripts of recorded phone conversations discussing illegal activities in barely coded language. Photographs of meetings between people who, according to the captions Eleanor had added, shouldn't have been meeting at all. a list of names with detailed notes about each person's role in the organization, their connections, their vulnerabilities. I started reading, picking folders at random, and the more I saw, the more I understood why Eleanor had been so careful, why she'd gone to such lengths to hide this material. This wasn't just evidence of past crimes. Many of the documents were recent, suggesting that Webb had continued gathering information even after his supposed death, or that the organization's activities had been ongoing for years. There were politicians, police officers, business owners, people with power and influence who'd used their positions to facilitate or cover up criminal activity. And there, in a folder labeled with my father's name, I found something that made my blood run cold. Documents showing that in the months before he died, he'd been planning something involving me specifically. Custody paperwork being prepared, applications to private schools in other states, communications with associates about securing the asset, meaning me. He hadn't lost interest after my mother disappeared. He'd been actively searching, and according to Webb's notes in the margins, he'd been getting close to finding me when his heart attack had saved me from whatever he'd had planned. "This is bigger than I thought," I said quietly, looking up at Webb. "This isn't just about protecting myself. If this information got out, it could help a lot of people. Put away people who are still hurting others." Webb nodded grimly. "That's the burden Eleanor didn't want to place on you, but couldn't avoid. She knew that walking away from this, destroying it, it would be the safe choice, but not the right one. And she knew that doing the right thing might cost you everything she and your mother had worked to give you." I thought about my mother, living under a different name somewhere in Oregon, hiding from a threat that no longer existed, but unable to risk revealing herself. I thought about Eleanor, spending her final years maintaining this elaborate structure of protection and accountability, dying without ever seeing me again. I thought about all the other families who might be trapped in situations like mine had been, children used as leverage, parents forced to comply with criminal demands because the alternative was losing everything they loved. The decision wasn't easy, but once I truly looked at what I was holding, at what Eleanor had preserved at such great cost, it became inevitable. "I'm going to turn it in," I said, "all of it, to the people my grandmother trusted." Webb studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I thought you might. You've got a sense of responsibility." He paused, then added, "But we need to be smart about it. Can't just walk into a police station with this. Some of the people documented in there have connections to local law enforcement. We need to go higher, federal level, and we need to do it in a way that protects you." Over the next several hours, Webb and I made a plan. He still had contacts from his FBI days, people he trusted who'd moved up into positions of real authority. We'd reach out to them carefully, arrange a meeting on neutral ground, and turn over copies of everything while keeping the originals secured. We'd make sure that my identity was protected as much as possible, that I was documented as a victim of the organization rather than a willing participant in bringing it down. It wouldn't guarantee my safety, Webb warned, but it would minimize the risk. As dawn began to break over the farm, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I stood on the porch again, looking out at the property that was mine. The fields that needed clearing, the house that needed repair, the barn that had held secrets too heavy for their small space. This place represented everything I'd lost and everything I might still build. It was the inheritance of pain and protection both, a physical manifestation of the impossible choices my family had made trying to keep me safe. Webb came out to join me, 2 cups of instant coffee he'd found in his truck in his hands. He offered me one, and we stood together in comfortable silence for a moment. "What will you do?" he asked finally, "after we turn everything over?" I took a sip of the coffee, bitter and too hot, and considered the question. "I think I'll stay," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "This farm, it's the only real connection I have to my family. I've got the money my mother saved, enough to start fixing the place up, make it livable again." I paused, then added, "And I'm going to call her, my mother. The number Eleanor left, I'm going to use it. Even if she can't come back right away, even if we have to be careful about it, I need her to know I understand, that I don't blame her, that I want her in my life, if she'll have me." Webb smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. "Eleanor would have liked that. She always hoped you two would find your way back to each other eventually." The sun was fully up now, warming the air, chasing away the morning chill. In a few hours, Webb and I would begin the process of contacting his old colleagues, of setting in motion the machinery that would hopefully bring down what remained of the organization that had stolen so much from my family. It would be complicated and possibly dangerous, and there were no guarantees about how it would end. But standing there on that porch, holding a cup of bad coffee and watching the sunlight spread across land that belonged to me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 12 years. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. 3 weeks later, federal agents raided 17 locations simultaneously, arresting 43 people on charges ranging from money laundering to human trafficking. The story made national news, though the specific details about how the evidence had been obtained were kept deliberately vague. My name never appeared in any public documents, protected by the agreements Webb and his contacts had arranged. I watched the news coverage from the living room of the farmhouse, which I'd been slowly cleaning and repairing. The satisfaction I felt wasn't triumphant or joyful. It was quieter than that, more like the relief of setting down a weight I hadn't fully understood I'd been carrying. 2 days after the arrests, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. My hand trembled slightly as I answered. "Lucas?" The voice was uncertain, hopeful, afraid. A woman's voice that I thought I remembered from dreams and half-forgotten memories. "Mom?" I said, and the word felt strange and right at the same time. "I saw the news," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "Marcus called me. He told me what you did, what you found. Lucas, I'm so sorry, for everything, for all the years." "I know," I said, and I meant it. "I understand now. I read your letter. I know why you had to leave." We talked for 2 hours, words spilling out in a rush, trying to bridge 12 years of silence with a single conversation. She told me about her life in Oregon, the small town where she'd been living under a different name, working as a librarian and wondering every single day if I was okay. I told her about Riverside, about the good parts and the hard parts, about the person I'd become in her absence. She cried more than once, and so did I, but they weren't entirely sad tears. At the end of the call, we made plans. Careful plans, because even with the arrests, we couldn't be certain that every threat had been neutralized. But plans nonetheless. She would come to visit the farm in a few months, after things had settled down. We'd meet properly as the people we'd become, rather than the mother and child we'd been forced to stop being. After we hung up, I walked outside and stood in the place that was becoming home. The evening air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of grass and earth and possibility. I thought about Eleanor, who I'd never known, but who'd shaped my life in ways I was only beginning to understand. I thought about the choices she and my mother had made, the prices they'd paid, the future they'd tried to protect for me. And I thought about the choice I'd made, to carry forward their fight for justice, even when walking away would have been easier and safer. The farm still needed work. The house still had rooms I hadn't even begun to clean, and the fields were still overgrown with years of neglect. But none of that felt overwhelming anymore. It felt like potential, like something worth building. As darkness fell, and the stars began to appear overhead, I went back inside to continue the work of transforming this place from a secret into a home, from a hiding place into a foundation. The story that had begun with abandonment and separation had become something else entirely. Not a happy ending exactly, because the scars remained and the years couldn't be returned, but a beginning. A chance to build something new from the fragments of everything that had been broken. And that, I thought as I climbed the stairs to the bedroom that was becoming mine, was more than I'd ever dared to hope for when I walked out of Riverside Children's Home with nothing but a duffel bag and a mysterious key. If you've made it to the end of Lucas's story, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to a story about family, sacrifice, and the complicated ways we protect the people we love. I want to ask you to hit that subscribe button, because this community is built on people who understand that life is rarely simple, that the people we think abandoned us might have been fighting battles we never knew about, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose truth over safety. Drop a comment and tell me, what did you learn from Lucas's story? Have you ever discovered that something you believed about your past wasn't the whole truth? And if you've got your own story about complicated family situations, about finding out things weren't what you thought, share it with us. This community thrives on real stories from real people, and your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember that sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones that help us understand where we came from.